patron saints of pressure. The sample is shining. And pressure turns out to be one of the most important things that we have all learned as a country, that we have all learned in the news in this first week since we swore in a new president, since we started sliding in American politics into a tire-screeching, out-of-control, full-speed U-turn. One of the important things we learned this week as we started to go through this radical change as a country is that as fast as things seem like they are changing, and as radical as these changes in direction seem, pressure matters. Pressure still works, at least some of the time. On Inauguration Day, a memo went out to all the employees at the Department of Health and Human Services. And that memo told them that without exception, people in that agency were no longer allowed to make any, quote, correspondence to public officials. No more correspondence to public officials, including members of Congress and governors, for example. And people who work at that agency started telling members of Congress, I'm sorry, we're now banned from speaking with you. I'm sorry, I can't go to that meeting with you. I'm sorry, I know you've made this request of a federal agency for information, but I can't answer that request for information because I have been banned from speaking with members of Congress. We've been told we're not allowed to provide any information to members of Congress or other elected officials. Democratic members of Congress, including Congressman Elijah Cummings and Congressman Frank Pallone, they went nuts in response to this gag order on all the employees of this agency. They wrote to the White House about it. News coverage of the gag order geared up. The new administration clearly had no explanation, no defense for what they had done. And now, you know what happened? They rescinded it. Now there has been a new memo to Health and Human Services employees rescinding the earlier order, telling them nothing they've received should in any way preclude or in any way interfere with them addressing elected representatives, either in person or in writing. And now the White House itself is disavowing ever having asked for that in the first place. No, that wasn't us. That had nothing to do with us. Must have been a typo. Same thing at the USDA. We reported Tuesday night that the 2,000 scientists at our nation's Agricultural Research Service, those scientists had been told they'd be no longer allowed to post any public information, including any scientific information. Nothing that the public could see. A gag order on everything from all of those scientists to anything that might make it to the public. That gag order on those 2,000 scientists made it to the press. White House got asked about it. Pressure started building, and hey, look, they took it back. They caved. They sent a follow-up message to the USDA scientists saying that the original order was, quote, hereby rescinded, adding for good measure, the Agricultural Research Service values and is committed to maintaining the free flow of information between our scientists and the American public. Yeah, they are now. After the American public found out they were trying to cut that off, and the American public got mad about it and said so, and then they caved. Same thing happened at the Environmental Protection Agency. We reported a couple of nights ago that staff at the EPA had been directed to take down the page at the EPA website that includes not just information about EPA climate change programs, but includes the EPA's climate-related data. Tons and tons and tons of giant data sets on climate. And all sorts of scientists rely on those data sets for all sorts of research. After being told to take down that whole site, after it was reported that EPA employees had been ordered to take that down, naturally, A, outrage, B, questions, C, pressure, and D, ultimately, they caved. They backed down. Quote, the Trump administration has walked back plans to scrub climate change references from the EPA website. And naturally, the White House spokesman is now denying that the Trump administration ever wanted that page taken down, totally disavowing any order to remove that information. And so maybe the climate change data sets at the EPA, maybe those will stay up. Tom Steyer, the environmentalist billionaire in California, says just for good measure, he has copied the website and all of its data sets now anyway, just in case. So if they do take it down, he's got a spare in case we need it, but still, maybe they won't take it down. It's also just happened at the VA. One of the first things that the new administration did was issue a blanket hiring freeze for the entire federal government. And that sounds like a great thing if you don't believe that the government does anything useful. But even if you like the idea of hiring freezes in general, ask American veterans. Ask them if it's a good idea to have a hiring freeze at the VA right now. at the VA, where the whole key to fixing the VA and staffing it up well enough so it can meet the demand for veterans' health care, so veterans are not waiting too long to see their doctors and getting to counseling, all those things that led to the VA scandal, the whole key to that actually is staffing up the VA. They've got tens of thousands of positions they are trying to fill. They are recruiting healthcare staff. They're recruiting people to work at the VA in all levels of VA service. And it's the linchpin. That hiring initiative is the linchpin for getting that organization where it needs to be to serve America's veterans. This was Paul Rieckhoff from Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America after the hiring freeze was announced. Quote, imagine you're a nurse considering working at either VA or a private health company. VA just got hit with a hiring freeze. Where would you go? Right, exactly. Veterans groups were livid about how much that blanket hiring freeze was going to set back efforts at the VA to get that agency together. And veterans groups and their supporters erupted. And honestly, the White House had no idea how to answer their questions or their concerns or how to respond to the ensuing pressure. The White House press secretary stood there at the podium and said, for the problems that have plagued the VA, hiring more people is not the answer. And the whole veterans community and everybody who knows anything about the VA responded in concert. Actually, yes, it is the answer. That is what we're trying to do to fix the VA. We all agree on that. And so now, having been exposed both for the bad idea and for their ignorance about its they've caved. Pressure worked. The Department of Veterans Affairs has just announced that it is proclaiming itself exempt from the hiring freeze, but only for specific positions necessary to meet public safety responsibilities. This is the memorandum they put out about that. Their exempted positions include medical officer, physician's assistant, nurse, optometrist, podiatrist, dental officer, chiropractor, psychologist, therapist, social worker, dietitian, occupational therapist, physical therapist, pharmacist, dental hygienist, laundry worker, food service worker, pest control, housekeeping aide. So yeah, hiring freeze applies to everybody, except for every job title the Veterans Administration can name, which they are proclaiming exempt from this stupid hiring freeze. Yeah, when veterans erupt, and veteran supporters erupt, and the press erupts in the way that they did in the face of that insult, and they create as much pressure around that as they did this week, turns out a lot of exemptions can be found for what was otherwise proclaimed to be a blanket policy with no exceptions. Well, now tonight it has happened again. It keeps happening. You might have heard yesterday that even though the deadline to sign up for health insurance, the enrollment period for getting into a new health insurance plan, comes to an end on Tuesday, and everybody always waits right until the deadline, right? Everybody always waits till the very last minute until they sign themselves up. You might have heard last night that the new administration had yanked all the ads and public service announcements telling people that that deadline is on Tuesday and people only have a few days left to sign up. I mean, these guys have not repealed Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act is still in effect. Signing up for a new health plan during the open enrollment period, that's still the way we Americans get health insurance. It doesn't benefit the Trump administration in any way if individual Americans miss that deadline and then have to go without health insurance. It doesn't help the Trump folks, but it does hurt individual Americans. But still, as of last night, their plan was to yank all of those ads, yank all of those PSAs, even the ones that they had already paid for. They said that they would rather waste the money and spend the money to run no ads. Yank the ads, spend the money anyway, but not run the ads. So just so fewer Americans would end up with health insurance, which is on its face outrageous. It therefore created outrage. It therefore created questions that the White House had a very hard time answering about why they were wasting Americans' taxpayer money for the specific purpose of making fewer Americans have health insurance. And so tonight, say it with me now, they caved. They caved in the face of that pressure. Quote, reversing course, Trump administration will continue Obamacare outreach. Oh, pressure works. Pressure doesn't always work. But let me quote that super psyched postdoc in the Harvard pressure physics lab. The sample is shining. The sample is shining. This is an interesting data sample, right? We've got case after case after case after case from just the first week of them being in office, where they tried to do something and then they took it back when people rose up against it, when they had no answer for the criticism, when they could not bear the pressure. Pressure sometimes works. And now we get a couple of very interesting, very big tests of that new principle that we have discovered about our new president and this new administration. A couple of really big tests. One of them, of course, is the wall. When the new president signed his Build the Wall order a couple of days ago, we were not exactly sure if it was another one of these symbolic campaign promise style orders that he has put out this week. These things that make it look like he's acting and making keeping a campaign promise, but really it's an order that has no effect. Like today, for example, he made a big show out of signing an executive order that basically says we're going to make the military way huger. We're going to have more ships, more troops, more planes. We're going to dramatically increase the size of the military. It's neat to know that he wants that. But him signing an order saying the military is about to get way bigger, that's the equivalent of me, like, proclaiming that I'm 7 feet tall and an astronaut, and I can grab a charcoal briquette and squeeze it with my superpower grip and make, you know, synthetic diamonds that they're going to use at Harvard to make metal hydrogen. I mean, I could say all of that stuff. I could tell you I'm Miss America. It might be neat to learn that I want to be those things because I said them. But you can't do that just by saying it. The new president proclaimed in this executive order today that he is making the military bigger. That is something that he cannot do, even with a big Sharpie signature. That's something that Congress has to do because it costs money. I mean, what he called an executive order on making the military bigger, that's essentially, apparently, a shorthand, non-official version of what his budget request will be, which is a nice heads up, but it's not an order. He doesn't need to sign it, let alone at a big ceremony where it seems like he, might be making the extra ships right there. It's just theater. That was nothing. One of the things we have learned with this new president is that he sometimes makes a really big deal out of doing nothing. He signs stuff, it's a big Sharpie signature. He makes a big show out of doing stuff that substantively is meaningless. He doesn't have the power to order it by executive order, or it's so unclear what the executive order is asking for that nobody in any agency acts on it or has plans to. He's proclaimed that he has done a bunch of things this week that don't actually affect the great changes he claims to be affecting. And so when he signed that order on building the wall on the southern border this week, we didn't know if it was going to be another one of those aspirational statements about something he wants, but he has no plans to get. We didn't know whether it was going to be another one of those or whether it was going to be a nuts and bolts thing. Well, we now know that he is directing the start of the construction of a wall on the border, but turns out he didn't persuade Mexico to pay for it. And so that request for a wall, which is what it is, it now becomes a request to Congress to please come up with a way to charge the American taxpayers for the cost of building that wall, which is not what he said in the campaign he was going to do. And so this is going to be one of the next big tests to see how they deal with pressure. Because the pressure on this was foreseeable. It has already begun, right? There's international pressure already. The president of Mexico canceling his planned visit to the United States, seeing his approval ratings at home skyrocket as he stands up to and says no and snubs the U.S. president. There's pressure in the American streets. Protests already. Americans, particularly in border states, saying, do not put a wall on that border. Now that we know the plan is to have the American people pay for it with taxpayer dollars, that does mean Congress is going to have to vote on an appropriation of taxpayer funds to pay for that wall. And that makes every congressional office around the country, Democrat and Republican, House and Senate, the future site of protests on this subject, the site of constituent visits, people telling their representatives and their senators, if you vote for that freaking appropriation for that stupid wall, we will never let you forget it. I mean, it is one thing to promise a big, beautiful wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, right? It's one thing to promise it. It's another thing to say, that's what I'm delivering, I swear. But actually getting it? Come on. It's going to mean every individual member of Congress from coast to coast withstanding pressure from their home district constituents about whether or not they want to help Donald Trump break that campaign promise about Mexico paying for the wall at the expense of the American people. They're going to have to bear that pressure in every congressional office in the country. So that will be a test of how they handle pressure. And so far, they're not handling pressure well. But now tonight, there's an even bigger test coming up.